we're really not seeing too much of a spike in price. We did get back over, the 40 range to 45. Now we dip back down and going up again. And I mean, why aren't we getting closer to that 50, 60 range that we used to be at when all of the things around us seem to be pointing to why Bitcoin is so important?
So one thing to look at is what large pools of capital are going to do, right? So I agree with you that the use case for Bitcoin, the argument for Bitcoin is more clear today than ever before. But in terms of, it's fund flows that determine the movement of an asset price, especially in any kind of multi-week, multi-month period. And so one thing I've been pointing out, for the past few months, is that if you look back historically at Bitcoin's price, you have the 4-year halving cycle, for example. Bitcoin generally done well after halving. But another way to look at it is that it's generally done well during rising PMI environments and is done poorly during falling PMI environments. So PMI stands for Purchasing Managers Indices, and it's kind of a rate of change indicator for the economy. And you can look at it in multiple different countries. I'm referring to the US PMI as one of the largest economies. And generally when you have that falling PMI environment, it's not necessarily that you have a recession, otherwise, but you can. It just means you have an economic softening. You have a slower period of growth that could become a recession under certain circumstances. So in the prior, say, 10 to 12 year expansion, we had about 3 cycles of rising PMI, falling PMI, rising PMI, falling PMI. And until the end of that period, until we kind of were running into COVID, we didn't really get an actual recession. And so when you have those falling PMI environments, generally risk assets, highly volatile assets, including Bitcoin, have struggled. And so, many of us might not view Bitcoin as a risk-on asset fundamentally, but just because of its volatility profile, a lot of large pools of capital will put it into that risk asset bucket. And so when you have this sort of situation, you naturally have a lot of risk managers looking to de-risk their portfolio, which for them means lower volatility. And so they'll trim things like Bitcoin, or at least maybe not start new investments in Bitcoin, while they have this kind of risk-off environment. And so my base case is that, anything can happen, correlations can break down, right? But that generally in a falling PMI environment, it's just generally challenging for Bitcoin. It's like a headwind, right? So everything else can be going well, and that's just this ongoing headwind. So what we've been seeing is that if you look at on-chain indicators, the supply side looks great, right? So obviously we know the supply cap, but I mean in terms of, say, the percentage of supply held by very strong illiquid hands, over the past year we've been in this choppy market. A lot of the coins have moved from short-term traders to longer-term traders, from accounts that have a higher propensity to sell to accounts with a very low propensity to sell, kind of the supply squeeze. But that's only one side of the equation. You need demand if you're going to get a big price increase. And just that demand has been somewhat lacking. Around the margins, there are people that say, oh, this is what Bitcoin is. And they buy it. But you don't really have these large pools of capital coming out and saying, we're going to put $1 billion in a Bitcoin now. We get it. I think that's something you might see in the next rising PMI environment. So I think what we're in now is we're setting up, the supply side's very tight, and we're kind of setting up for the next bull run. And, it's hard to say when it starts. Maybe we've already seen the bottom. I think there's a decent chance we've already seen the bottom. Just because we're chopping around doesn't mean that you can't chop around in a mild bull market until you get some sort of catalyst that gives you a renewed bull market. Or we could just chop around sideways, even go a little bit lower. It's hard to say for sure because, it's a very volatile asset, and it's kind of based on, a small number of new billionaires coming into the market or not. If you get a couple Michael Saylors, that just changes everything. All the models are broken, right? So, it's hard to actually give that kind of near-term price prediction. But I'm generally bullish long-term while being kind of uncertain for a 6-month period because we're in this kind of choppy risk-off environment in terms of macro.
But out of curiosity, I mean, what sorts of things are you looking for? Right now, I feel like the amount of news and information, especially because of the conflict that's happening right now and the macroeconomic environment, it's like things are coming at us from every direction. So you personally, Lyn, what are you looking for? What's maybe the best case scenario that you're predicting, and maybe what's the worst case scenario that you're hoping you don't see?
Well, I think the best case scenario is kind of a de-escalation of some of the military conflict that's happening in Ukraine right now, and for kind of the next cycle to start, right? So right now we're in a declining PMI environment. Most economic indicators are pointing down. That eventually reverses one way or another. It could be that they try to do stimulus again. right? Or it could be another factor. Basically, the endless money printing kicks on again, right? So right now, when we're in this kind of trend, trends tend to be sticky until they're not, right? So until we see catalysts that this trend is changing, it's just generally a defensive environment. That doesn't mean you can't get strong counter rallies, and that doesn't even necessarily mean that it could be that the Bitcoin bottom's already in. And that we already see maybe the worst, and then we're just kind of chopping up, maybe chopping sideways to up. It's hard to say for sure. And so I think this is a really strong accumulation period for Bitcoin. I think it's a good period for dollar cost averaging, recurring purchases, things like that. It's just that as a trading call, it's something that I think it could go either way in the next few months.